Okay, I want to talk really quickly about this guy, John Bell, and Bell's inequality, and what it may potentially say about the possibility of a literal universe from nothing. Not the quantum fluctuations universe from nothing, but from a very literal nothingness. The big cosmic question that everybody asks at some point is, why is there something rather than nothing, right? Why does something exist? Where did it all come from? Doesn't it make more sense to say that we just shouldn't exist? There should just be nothing. There shouldn't be anything. It should just be nothingness. Well, I've spent a while trying to answer this question, and I decided to start from first principles, right? Just start from the first, most logical step here, which would be that nothing did or does exist, and that somehow somethingness emerges from the nothingness. Now, a while back, I read A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. Deeply disappointed. I like Krauss, but man, he really tried to worm his way around that one without actually answering the question. So, reality from nothingness. How could that possibly happen? Well, if we step back and remember, we're just hypothesizing here, okay? We're not trying to make any solid conclusions. We're just trying to reason this out. How would this happen? If this is how it happened, how would it happen? So let's start with the assumption that nothing exists, or that nothing once existed, and that this all is emergent from that nothingness somehow. Okay, so we're established, our little theoretical, playground here is established, right? We're starting with absolute nothing. No quantum fluctuations, no virtual particles, no energy, no spatial dimensions, right? No time, no width, length, depth, nothing. Literally nothing. Is there something, no matter how inconsequential, no matter how abstract, no matter how silly, is there something that simply as a reaction to there being absolutely nothing that would spring into existence? What could possibly come into existence if there was truly nothing? Well, the closest thing I could think of, and this fully depends on whether or not there are things that can exist that are not substrate dependent. What I mean by that is, if certain concepts or just things can come into existence without it needing some sort of material or energetic substrate for it to exist, right? Then we've got something here. Now, that's kind of the fulcrum on which this whole thing rests, right? If there are things that can come into some sort of existence without the need of being dependent on some sort of substrate to exist, then we've got a little something to work with. Now, given that, philosophers have long since talked about similar sorts of things, right? Like Plato's Platonic world, where perfect forms exist. Here's my thinking on this. I don't know that there's a Platonic world, but let's say that simply as a reaction to the pure nothingness, that you have an instant, almost anti-nothingness that comes into existence in the form of what I have called a metability. Now, what I mean by mutability, where this is not a probability or a possibility. Okay, probabilities, first of all, are the probability of something happening, and it is typically between 0 and 1. So it ranges, its range is mostly in the existence spectrum, okay, whether or not something is going to happen. Possibility is whether or not something is possible, okay. If you don't have a material universe, then material interactions are not possible. So possibility shares kind of is the other side of a coin, right, with impossibilities. Now, impossibilities are those things which cannot possibly exist at all under any circumstance. If you start with nothingness, it seems to me that the one thing that could exist would be the possibilities of worlds and universes that could exist if something could exist. So it's like, a couple orders of magnitude up the ladder from possibility, right? You've got probabilities, which are constrained by possibilities, which are constrained by impossibilities, which are constrained by metabilities. I hope you kind of see that, the sense that makes. So within a purely nothing state, if possibilities or metabilities could exist that are not substrate dependent, then we've got something that we can work with here. Now, given that's a big fucking if, right? Like we're playing with fire here, okay? So let's see if we can close that gap with analyzing what a universe would look like if it was constructed from a metabalistic sort of lineage of reactions within itself. So, first things first, because you're starting with nothing, you don't have possibilities. A lot of people say, if you start with nothing, well, the one thing that can exist are possibilities. But you don't have anything, so you can't have any possibilities. So you've got to have, and you don't have anything, so you don't really have impossibilities either. So you've got to have metabilities. You've got to have something that kind of fathers that whole line of what is possible or what is not possible, or both. If it's possible that things can exist that are not substrate dependent, then I think it's possible for a metability to take on a life of its own. Remember, it's not substrate dependent. It's not reliant on the nothingness per se. It's not reliant on any sort of material, anything that doesn't exist, right? What kind of world would emerge from this? First of all, qualia would make a little bit more sense. Anything that is not substrate dependent, it would more or less be the essence of, right? It would be built on essences. It would be built on the precursors of qualia. Okay? So you would have kind of, all just these kind of potentials that aren't really potentials, that don't really exist, but they're just kind of there, And at some point in its, I guess, self-development or self-interaction, it just, it kind of Big Bang-ish sort of thing here going on, right? It just kind of like continues to become more complex as these metabilities turn into possibilities and probabilities and impossibilities and improbabilities, and it kind of flowers out from there. But yeah, I think you start with, first of all, there's been a lot of research, and very interesting research, done on the information nature of the universe, right? That there literally seems to be almost a digital representation that gave birth to our universe. Well, if you have nothingness and you have some sort of I guess slightly existent almost somethingness that doesn't really exist, you kind of get your precursors for 1 and 0 right there, right? You've got 0 and 1. So let's keep going. This continues to build, and as it progresses, what would we expect our world to look like if, in fact, it was spawned from metability? Which, by the way, would mean that it doesn't really exist. We're just living out the internal state of metability momentarily spawned from the fact that there really is actually nothing, which means that nothing actually exists. That this is just, first of all, a being inside of a metability, given that nothingness is the base, given that there is truly absolutely nothing, and this metability just kind of comes into kind of existence for a second, the intelligences described within that metability, that would be the most real thing possible, right? So when you have absolutely nothing, and then you have something that's kind of there, that something that's kind of there would be far more real to the inhabitants described by that something that is just kind of there than the nothingness that actually exists, which means it would make sense for everything to actually look like it was real to us. But we're just being described by this metability. All right, let's talk about quantum mechanics. Oh yeah, so the consciousness thing, right? That would solve the consciousness problem, first of all. It also aligns with the information theories of reality, right? The ideas and the studies and the research that have shown that there is some sort of informational foundation to all of reality, given that we're really starting off with nothing and kind of something, your predecessors to 0 and 1. And because this kind of something isn't really something, it's just the essence of a possibility of and impossibilities and probabilities of what potentially could be if something could exist. Well, yeah, that's just essence, which means there's nothing material about it at all whatsoever, which kind of gives a little bit of lends a little bit of a hand to qualia and the conscious experience. And now, back to Bell's inequality. Because what the fuck, right? Big problem. Quantum physics is absolute nonsense. Unless, let's think about what it's really telling us. Quantum mechanics. What is quantum probability? Well, it is the particle or the wave, the wave's potential of existing in one specific form and place and time. That's weird, right? It's the potential of it existing somewhere? How does that make any sense? Well, it would make sense if we lived in a metability, which was kind of, interacting and flickering in and out because nothing actually exists. That nothingness in between would totally fit the bill, right? So it would be difficult to say how the nothingness and how the metability, reacts to the nothingness, and do they flicker back and forth? Is it some sort of like layering thing where they just layer on top of each other, even though that's not really a dynamic that could happen? It's a potential dynamic that could happen if that dynamic could happen, because we're dealing with metabilities. Doesn't necessarily mean that spirits exist, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a God, doesn't necessarily mean that you continue to exist after you die. What it means is that nothing exists, that this is a self-induced illusion brought about by the metability on its own self, that we are all just part of this ethereal description of a potential universe if universes could exist. And that's why when we try to look closer to the fundamental building blocks of our universe, it starts to fizzle out. It starts to just not make sense anymore. It stops being classically mechanical, and it starts to just exist, but not exist, but it exists, but it doesn't exist. Does that sound familiar? You see what I'm saying? There's a lot of sense that could be made, from consciousness to quantum what the fuckery. I think those are the two big questions we have, right? The nature of reality and consciousness, and this sort of a dynamic, which is really just a dynamic that could exist if this dynamic was something that could exist, that would actually help fill in some gaps and answer the fucking big question of why is there something rather than nothing? Well, because nothing exists. It is nothing. There isn't something. This is just a reflection of a metability in on itself that we are, momentarily participating in, and it will be gone in no time, cosmic time-wise. All right, that's just kind of what I wanted to say there. Just listening to the Nobel Prize stuff with the new Nobel Prize winners, and the whole thing with Bell's inequality. It's been something that's been on my mind for a while, and I just wanted to kind of, drop that. Think I'm crazy if you want, but I think of all things, of all attempts to explain everything that we can't explain, this makes the most sense. All right. Cheese and crackers. Have a good day.